We're going to kick off Data Summit Connect with a keynote talk from Rainie, Director of Internet and Technology Research at the Pew Research Center. So in addition to all the work he does at the Fact Tank, he's written several books, the most recent of which is Networked, the New Social Operating System. We're going to take questions directly following his talk, so do put your questions into the Q&A box. Then we're going to turn the webinar over to Bruno Kurtig. He is the founding VP, Strategy and Solutions at Sumo Logic. Prior to that, he was President of Product Management for SIEM, and he's also had roles at SenSage, Boston Consulting Group, WebMethods, and Anderson Consulting. Again, if you have questions for the speakers, please enter them in the Q&A box. I'll be monitoring those and I'll be able to pass them along to the speakers. And remember, you can also communicate via the chat box. So let me now turn this over to Rainie. Lee.
Hi, Mary Dee. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And I'm just preparing to share my slides here. It's a real delight to be with you. I'm sorry we can't be together in person, but it's a wonderful opportunity for the Pew Research Center and my little slice of it, the division that looks at internet and technology research. At Pew, we define ourselves, as Mary Dee mentioned, as a fact tank, not a think tank. Think tanks are in a different line of work from the line of work we see ourselves being in. They are in the business of promoting solutions to problems that their scholars and analysts and advocates see in the world. So they're very much in the business of advocacy, trying to change the world. Fact Tank doesn't do that kind of thing. At Pew, we do a lot of research, much of which I'll be sharing with you today that we think is relevant to your worlds. But we don't do it with an agenda tied to our work. I'm not a cheerleader for the internet. I'm not a cheerleader for data analytics. There are no Pew master plans to promote policies or solutions to problems related to the technology or things like that. We are very neutral, and I am actually prohibited from expressing my personal opinion in any form that I address. So I hope you'll forgive me if I always sort of default back to the data that we have gathered on these subjects related to you. So I thought I'd start by talking today about something that I think is likely an experience in every dimension of your lives. People are of two minds when they think about data. There are sides of them that are just as worried can be about the implications of lots of data collection and analytics. And there are sides of them that deeply appreciate all the benefits and conveniences and perhaps health improvement that they can get out of data. And so there's this push me, pull you dimension that was really strongly illustrated by this little opening set of slides that I'm going to share with you. So you might remember last year, the editorial pages of the New York Times. So this is a special initiative of the people who aren't necessarily journalists, although a bunch of journalists got involved in it at the Times. But they put together a year-long program looking at privacy issues and the degree to which data collection, data surveillance, data analytics were a ubiquitous part of people's lives. One of the most striking things that they did was they got a data set from a cell phone vendor or a data broker who works with a cell phone company, and it was given to them covertly. This was a sort of under the table exchange that the data set was made available to the Times, but they said it was from a confidential source, not a publicly identified source. But what it was 2 years worth of cell phone data with millions of cell phones that they packaged together in this amazing set of graphics and text describing how at the level of individual cell phones, analysts could figure out where people were, what buildings they were entering, what people they might have been meeting with who are also in the vicinity of them. One of the most famous parts of this analysis was they showed where President Trump's phone likely had been traveling both inside the White House and also at his resort at Mar-a-Lago as he went from the winter White House from his resort to his golf course up there. It was just spooky to watch these little blips of data marching around the world, and that was what it was meant to be. It was a very strong piece of evidence that the Times editors thought was worth people knowing and probably worth being scared about. Fast forward to this April, when the same kinds of cell phone data, the location data that's generated by cell phone apps and maybe the Bluetooth functions of phones, is being used and celebrated in tracking down how people are moving around in the midst of when they were supposed to be sheltering in place and practicing social distancing. So this is another data set of cell phone material, but this one was very publicly disclosed by a company that was happy to share its data with the New York Times, because the data is being used in the context of helping fight the pandemic, helping determine where spots of the outbreaks might occur. And there was just this elaborate other set of graphics emerging from these data about which communities were sheltering in place pretty well and where the citizens were pretty well practicing social distancing, as opposed to places where people were moving around a lot and indifferent to their activities. So this is a perfect example of the situational context for lots of data. Sometimes people are quite worried about it. Sometimes people are quite happy to celebrate some of the ways in which data can make their lives better, make them safer, make them healthier. We gathered some information about the sort of idea of people being tracked and their apps being used to track them in a survey that we did in mid-April, April 7th to April 12th. And Americans are sort of cynical when it comes to data collection and the use of data, and particularly in a privacy context. So in this particular case, about 60% of Americans in a big nationally representative sample of adults said that they doubted that any kind of surveillance set up or any kind of monitoring that was set up through cell phone apps and location apps would make a difference in fighting the coronavirus. At Pew, we specialize, of course, since these are nationally representative samples, they are meant to represent all kinds of adults, young and old, rich and poor, well-educated, less well-educated, different racial and ethnic communities across the board. And you see that when you start unpacking these data, people in different groups have different feelings about whether location information would be helpful in fighting the pandemic or not. You'll see here that Hispanics, for instance, were much more likely to think that it would help, at least a little, than Black Americans or whites. People who have a high amount of education were also much more likely to think that data collection and surveillance would be helpful than those who had lower levels of education. And there's a bit of a partisan tinge to this, although it's, there are lots of issues in American culture that are partisan. This one doesn't feel too toxically partisan, but there are differences between Republicans and Democrats. Republicans are a bit more likely to think that it won't make that much of a difference. And you'll see in some of my later slides, Republicans and Democrats do have different views about the value, worthiness, and danger related to cell phone tracking. We also sort of posed a series of questions that illustrate quite beautifully how people think about data, think about privacy, think about the benefits of data in a very conditional and contextual kind of way. So when you offer them trade-offs, the data are being collected and analyzed for purpose A or purpose B, they often give you different answers. In this particular case, we were asking about the use of location tracking data. Would it be acceptable or not acceptable for the tracking data to be applied to those who have tested positive for the coronavirus in order to understand how the virus may be spreading? You can see there, it's kind of a split verdict. 52% said at least it was a bit acceptable, and 48% said it was not very acceptable. So that's about a tie. That's a split verdict. And the next level down, we asked about location data used for those who may have had contact with someone who tested positive for the coronavirus. Again, a little bit less accepting of that, the American public is, than accepting of it. But then when it gets down to sort of the enforcement potential piece of that, Are the data going to be used to ensure that those who test positive are complying with experts' advice on limiting social contact during the outbreak? And it's much less acceptable to the American public than being acceptable. So there are ways in which, even in the context of a very specific thing like the coronavirus, people, depending on what the use of the data is and depending on how intrusive the interventions might be, people have different views about whether it's an acceptable or unacceptable thing. And again, you see there are differences by different racial and ethnic groups, by different age groups, and a bit of, again, sort of partisan differences related to this. The Hispanics are sort of across the board are more likely to find these uses of data acceptable. Young people are a little less likely to think it's acceptable. And Democrats are more likely than Republicans to think that data use is that acceptable. So the complexity of the life that you all who are data analysts and are gathering and trying to use data for good face a pretty skeptical audience when it comes to your customers or the people from whom data might be being collected. And it depends even on who's being asked, because people in different situations and in different groups have different experiences with wanting data to be collected. So then we're gathering this data in the midst of the coronavirus outbreak in the context of lots of privacy work that we have done over the years. The most recent of which I'm going to walk you through right now, which came out in a report that we issued in November. So literally around the time the first coronavirus cases were occurring in Wuhan, China, we did a survey and reported on how Americans are concerned and confused and don't feel like they have control over their personal information. And that's sort of the grand story of really the past decade or 15 years, this wariness, this confusion, this concern, this distrust of data collectors has become more pronounced for a variety of reasons. So here are the data underlying the headline of that report, where we asked a series of questions of people both about companies collecting data and the government connecting data. And you'll see there's a bit of variance depending on whether the company is a collector or the government is a collector. But by and large, people say they don't feel like they have control over the data that companies or the government collects. They feel that the potential risks of collecting the data about them outweighs the benefits, which is a really striking thing because, you know, there are so many interesting and important and good stories to tell about uses of data that have made improvements in people's lives. But the public is just not generally sold on that idea, particularly in the case of companies providing them benefits from the data collection that is being done. They're concerned over how the data is collected, and they have very little understanding. Then one of the striking things that's emerged in the past 5 or 6 years is this sense that the surveillance systems, the data gathering systems, the analytics and what they result in are just sort of a mystery, are a black box thing. And a lot of people have told us in previous surveys, if you really, we asked a question, if you really needed to get to the bottom of something, if you want to know what was going on in your life and data collection, do you think you could do it? And many, many people say, no, I couldn't. I don't even know where I would begin to an inquiry like that. And a lot of this now falls on the data collection companies and the analytics companies because people don't necessarily trust them. There's a huge story, of course, for a generation or more in this country about Americans being less and less trusting and confident in all kinds of institutions, starting with the government, but also corporations, their churches, and things like that. And so when we asked specifically about the stewards of these data and whether people were confident that the data being collected would be in good hands, you know, they're not convinced that companies that collect the data would publicly admit mistakes and take responsibility for them. They're not convinced that they would be held accountable by outside authorities to account for the way they use the data. They are not sure that the data would be used in ways that make them themselves comfortable. And that they certainly aren't sure that they would be notified if there were any problems, if the data were misused or compromised or hacked into. So there's this backdrop of a layering of trust on top of the issues specific to the data collection process. We also gather information about you know, the sort of broad effect of technology companies and data collection companies on the society. And it was very striking, starting just around 2016, so when the culture was in the midst of that election and all the material related to that. We asked a long-standing trend question, what kind of an impact do you think technology companies have on the way things are going in the country? And for the first time, there was a collapse in those data. Usually people felt pretty good about technology companies, so going back to 2010 when we asked that question. But you'll see on the right side there that in the case of both Republicans and Democrats, there was a substantial drop-off in the positive views that people had in the impact of technology companies, and a rise in the negative views that people felt about the companies. They also, a very front and center issue, just before, just at the end of I guess now 10 days ago, President Trump announced that he was going to try to change some of the laws applying to technology companies and the way they perform. And that's done against a backdrop where a lot of Americans, particularly Republicans, think that social media companies, who are in many respects are the sort of face of technology to the broad public, they feel that the social media sites intentionally censor political viewpoints that they find objectionable. Majorities say that's the case across the board, but it's much more likely to be Republicans than Democrats who feel that. And part of the reason is that Republicans think that the technology companies support the views of liberals over conservatives. That blue line at the top of the chart there, 64% of Republicans think that the tech companies privilege liberals over conservatives. And that's just, it's a sign of how political polarization now affects so many things in the culture, but it also is part of the techlash that I was referring to in the title of this talk. People are just increasingly wary, and sometimes for political reasons, about the performance of data collection companies and things like that. The public is not convinced that technology companies can prevent misuse of their platforms in this election. This was a survey that was just done maybe 3 months ago. And you will see that between September 2018 and January 2020, there's been a drop-off in confidence that the technology companies can protect their platforms from misuse during the election. That's again sort of a way that politicization of the entire information ecosystem, and I would argue the data ecosystem, has not been a helpful thing for businesses like yours, at least in the broad context of cultural confidence in you. Another thing that we've found is we've done some data analytics on the performance of social media companies. In this case, we looked at what was happening on Facebook, and we looked at the Facebook postings of members of Congress. So we identified every member of Congress, their Facebook account, and then looked at the kind of language that they used in their posts. And when they used language that showed no disagreement with anybody on the political spectrum, political opponents, or any disagreement or anything, they got a very different response than when they expressed indignant agreement. In other words, the more angry, the more venomous, the more toxic, the more challenging the nature of the post, the words in the post, the more likely it got more likes, it got more comments, and more shares. So the metrics, the incentives that are built into many social media systems in particular, encourage the kind of sort of angry discourse that's facing the culture. And it's the information environment. If people are thinking about data as a reflection of the information environment around them that they see, they're looking at the incentives of social media companies and thinking, gosh, you guys are rewarding things that aren't necessarily doing our culture any good. And that results in people saying that technology companies probably ought to be more regulated than they currently are, which is not surprising. We didn't press them on specific policy proposals. In many cases, they would like a bit more care taken about misinformation, but in some cases, they would like the companies to enable more free speech. In some cases, they would like companies to do more than they currently do about bullying and things like that online. So, but we didn't particularly test that in this battery of questions. People just think that the companies have a lot of power and that they aren't necessarily in good shape to sort of self-regulate and do the things that the broader culture would like them to do. But here's the paradox of this, of course. People perfectly well understand that there are ways to use data to bring benefits in the world. And so we asked a question about, we asked a variety of questions about broad uses of data and whether they would be acceptable or not. And you see that there are plenty of ways that at least a plurality of Americans say, yeah, it's okay to use data this way. So they're by 49% to 27% margin, acceptable, not acceptable. They're okay with poorly performing schools sharing student data with a nonprofit that's seeking to improve educational outcomes. By a pretty similar margin, 49% to 31%, they're perfectly okay with the government collecting data about Americans to assess potential terrorist threats. They're even okay with DNA testing companies sharing customers' genetic data with law enforcement to help solve crimes. And it becomes a little bit more of a split verdict when it gets down to fitness tracking app makers sharing their data with medical researchers to better understand the link between exercise and heart disease. So the broad story told in this slide, in this series of questions, is, again, that Americans are in a conditional and contingent frame of mind when they're thinking about collection of their data and using their data. They're not always opposed to it or always in favor of it. They're not always happy about it collecting or always sad about it. It really is context specific. It depends a lot on why the data are being used. It depends a lot on who's collecting the data and whether the collector is a trustworthy broker and steward of the data. So there are a lot of things that you all are balancing in your lives as you are trying to do your work and trying to convince your customers and the people you're serving that it's for good purposes. It's for their benefit that this is happening. So the last round of slides I wanted to share was about some work we do that isn't public opinion data, but it's a canvassing of thousands of technology experts and pundits and academics who think about technology. And I wanted to at least share with you, after giving a pretty bleak story in those previous slides, these experts have a number of ways that they articulate a very bright future where the datafication of all kinds of life, the collection and analytics story can work out pretty well. First of all, we asked them, in the midst of the pandemic, how important has the internet been for you getting through this crisis? And more than half, 53%, said the internet has been essential, and another 34% said it's been important but not essential. And it's particularly young people, again, Hispanics are especially reliant and enthusiastic about the internet. It's those in upper income families, those with college educations, and there's a little bit of a partisan difference down at the bottom of the slide. So first of all, in the context of at least studying the internet and the analytics and data that come out of the internet, people can well articulate why it works for them and why it matters to them. As we've looked more deeply into the future, say looking out over the next 10 to 15 years, these experts sounded a number of themes. And positive things about what would happen. So they argued that information sharing over the internet would be effortlessly interwoven into daily life. That'll make people smarter, safer, and more efficient. And I imagine that lots of you listening to this are in the business of fulfilling those goals. One of the analysts used the word computation, which is essentially communication via data. And he was talking about involving smart agents. So our smart agents will be dealing with each other and we'll be able to outsource lots of the logistics and sort of silly time-consuming parts of our life to agents that might help us plan our lives. So that's one theme they sounded. They talked about the sort of broad awareness that people will have of their world and their own behavior. And that the benefits that would come from this, especially for improved healthcare. A lot of talk about personalized medicine, a lot of talk about population level studies that might give you insights into disease outbreaks and treatments. And a lot of talk about education. Healthcare and education have been two areas where the applications of technology have been pretty narrow. If you look at the way technology has changed the news business and the publishing business and so many other businesses, there has not been the same level of dramatic change in healthcare and education, but these experts say that especially in the age of data, the transformation of healthcare and the transformation of education will be incredible things to behold and will bring very tangible benefits to people's lives. They also talk about, smart structures and smart supply systems themselves. And as the environment gets more intelligent, a lot of talk about smart homes, smart communities, smart environments around us. And I'm sure a lot of you are working on systems and structures that will, tell us when problems are arising before they really get serious. Tell us when we can make our lives more efficient and safe. Tell us when we're in trouble and we need to get help. So there are lots of ways that these analytics will play into us. I'll just do a real quick run through the dark sides because they give voice to them too. They're worried about privacy just as the way the general public is. They're worried about the impact of a lot of analytics work and artificial intelligence on impinging into jobs that people are paid for now, and what might that do to labor markets and the sort of broad cultural expectations there are about people being gainfully employed and finding meaning in their lives that way. They're worried about increased digital divides related to people mastering the technology and moving far ahead of their fellow citizens, not at the same pace, and that's just a breeding ground for resentment and possible violence. And that's a big thing that they worry about. Of course, anytime you bring up technology, and a top of mind concern is everything getting hacked. And finally, talk about sort of human nature and how it's abused by all the new technologies that are coming out. And they think that the darker sides of human nature get amplified and accelerated by some of the changes that are out there, and that's very much on their minds. So with that, I thank you for attention to me through all of this, and I'm really interested in hearing what your questions are.
Thanks so much, Lee. I was sort of interested when you were talking earlier about the trust issues and do people trust the government? Do they trust corporations? How far back does Pew's research on that go? Is this something that's changed over time? And if so, how far back have you been able to trace changes?
Pew has picked up on some long-standing trend questions related to trust in institutions that date to the 1960s. I think it might even go back to the 50s, that were done by the Gallup polling organization. The creator of the Pew Research Center used to be the president of the Gallup organization before he came and founded Our Place. And so we've relied on those Gallup data for a long time. And the interesting story is that in the 50s and into the 60s, the Vietnam and the end of the 60s was beginning to change the story. There was incredible trust in institutions of all kinds. What's so interesting about the trust story is that it's not necessarily a fully lockstep story, but there are big trends in it. So once trust in government began to fall, that was the same in the 60s, and then certainly in the 70s and moving on from that. It was also the period of decline in trust of big business. It was the period of decline of trust in banks and other kinds of corporations. Then sort of later in the 80s, particularly as religion became something that was politicized in some people's minds, their trust in the church and church leaders began to decline. And so nowadays, trust has taken a big hit sort of across the board. There are exceptions to the story. The military, the US military, has actually had a restoration of trust from the 1970s and 1980s, and it has absolutely bucked the tide. There are groups that have high levels of trust. I tell my library friends that public trusts you just like they trust nurses and they trust firefighters. And there's a little bit of a comeback coming, and it'll be really interesting to see after the pandemic ends how people are thinking about sort of public health institutions, and particularly as maybe representatives of government. That people won't trust the federal government for a long time, but if you unpack it and sort of say the health institutions of government, we already see in our data that people kind of appreciate in a special new way the Centers for Disease Control, local public health authorities, the local medical community at large. And so it's a moving story.
Okay. We do have a question, which was a question that I was going to ask too, but I'll read this question, which is, do you have any research on how the opinions are different in other countries compared to ours? I know most of your research is US based, but both for people who are currently in other countries or for companies doing business in other countries, what differences do you see? I'm pretty sure that right now, as of today, the New Zealanders are probably very happy with their government because they've basically opened up completely, being COVID-free. But I don't know whether you're collecting any international data.
We do collect some data, less so on the trust question. It's not nearly as probed in depth by our global researchers as we probe it, in part because we get to do it in lots of surveys, and their surveys are so expensive to do. But it's an interesting, particularly when it comes to technology. There are actually some pretty interesting parallel patterns in other countries, particularly interestingly in developing countries. So this is not just a developed country story. That we've done some survey work in developing countries, and they have the same enthusiasms for technology as well as concerns about it. So they love how it makes their life more efficient. It loves the convenience of the connectivity. They love how people can stay in touch with each other in ways that they couldn't before, and with frequencies that are unheralded in the human condition. But they also worry a lot about the kids, and they worry about the impact of technology on their kids. They worry about bad actors disrupting societies with technology through misinformation. When we did some focus groups in 4 developing countries about 1.5 years ago, in countries where English was hardly used by any of the population, the English term fake news was used in each of those countries. So you can see that there's a sort of viralness to the misinformation concerns that people have. And you know what, we were trying to probe for feelings that people might have about trusting American companies, which are the premier social media platforms in almost every place except and they're okay with it. They understand that these are American firms. They don't necessarily have the same level of concern about privacy in some cases that Americans do, but they are it's a little bit of a nag for folks, not necessarily an overwhelming one.
This is kind of a comment more than a question, I think, but the data collection consent form is usually very long and with terms that are not easily understandable. Do you know if there's any sort of initiative or plan to address that, to simplify it, make it more accessible? Would that, do you think, affect people's response to some of the questions you've been asking in your surveys?
It's a great and a not necessarily answerable question. So Americans say they want control of their data, but when you give them opportunities to opt out of programs or to check different boxes to have certain processes not applied to them, they barely read. Most Americans don't read them. They certainly don't read them comprehensively and know what's going on in the background. So what's been interesting about the modern era, let's call it the internet era of data collection, the notice and consent process that served the medical community amazingly well in eras gone by, just doesn't work when you're sort of on the fly doing something quickly. You want to click through to get the information or get the service or get the product that you want. And so, there are a variety of experiments that people have tried. The other big initiative that's coming from the sort of consumer-oriented side of digital life are giving people technology tools to control their own data. so that they would, essentially have a wallet, a digital wallet where they could volunteer to give up their data under certain circumstances, but not have it used for other purposes. And there are technological ways to maybe lock down data or to make it available for one-time use or to shut it down after a sunset period or something like that. So there are any number of initiatives on the consumer-oriented side that might be aimed at things like that. But by and large, people think it's a system that is indecipherable and is not necessarily good for them.
Well, those consent forms are usually written in legalese anyway.
Yeah.
It's not only are they long, it's even when you read them, you're not sure you understand what they're saying, what you're agreeing to.
Exactly, which is why, why I'm sure many of the participants here have a struggle with their data collection. They go through pretty extensive procedures to try to gauge what consumers want and to get their permission to do what they want to do.
Yeah.
But probably everybody on this call can cite an aspect of data for good. In other words, these data could be applied certainly at the population level for some great, wonderful public purpose. And yet all of the restrictions that we put in on the front end for sharing and restrictions on data use have gotten in the way of the data being shared with people in authority who are charged with our well-being. And so this is part of the confusing and very conditional story that applies to data.
Well, I think that's part of what you showed when you had that slide about acceptance of data sharing and when was it okay. And all of that, as you pointed out, depended on the why. Like the DNA data. Well, if it's catching criminals, yeah, that's a good thing. But what if the question were phrased differently? They might say, well, no, I don't want it to be done for that purpose, but if you're catching criminals, that's okay.
Yeah, it's absolutely that's the case, and we hear that a lot. It's also the who's collecting the data.
Who is collecting the data?
Getting back to your first question, who do you trust? Who will be a good steward? Who, bad stuff is going to happen. Will you get notified about it or not? And actually, it's the transfer of the data to yet another third party or a broker, and the bundling of the data in ways that were never anticipated by the original collector. That's what's also a lot on people's minds and freaks them out.
Yeah. Okay, we've got another question here. In your research, are you seeing a desire for people wanting their data deleted?
Yes. We asked a series of questions in that report that I flagged the cover of about the right to be forgotten. The European version of this applies to search engines and what can be scraped and scanned and rendered as search results in Europe, and you have the right to be forgotten. You can appeal to Google and basically say, take this aspect of my past out of your search results. They can sit, they don't have control over where the data sit in the in a server, but they do have control over whether Google searches it or not. Americans like that system, and they like it in particular related to sensitive information like their healthcare information. They would love it sunsetted out, and part of the California law, addresses this a little bit.
Well, the other interesting thing about that is that at one point, Google was required to observe GDPR here in the United States, and they just won that battle so that, yes, you can get to things here that you cannot see if you are in Europe. I did a little test of this last week with a European friend of mine. We were doing exactly the same searches, and we did on one particular name. He had 56 hits. I had 51,000.
Yeah, wow.
That's kind of a big difference.
Yeah, really. Which speaks to the issue that comes up a lot in our work, and people have sort of a gut reaction concern about this. We've never seen companies that have this scale before. Facebook is the biggest country in the world by population, and the fact that so much information is at Facebook's disposal and Google's disposal. It's hard for individual nation states or even collectives of nations to get their arms around what this all means. And of course, you know, the frustration that they will talk about at the technology companies is, you know, now I've got to have separate policies, just like the one you experienced.
Yeah.
Where, you know, the European experience of my tool is different from the American experience. And I've got to engineer around that, and that, you know, that there are all sorts of ways that doesn't work terribly well.
This is true. This is true. We did have another question about, basically, I'm just going to paraphrase this one. It basically says, when is the United States going to have GDPR? I mean, we already have the California law. This is probably outside your actual purview at Pew, but
Yeah,
there's a lot of research that's being done on privacy legislation.
There is, and it seemed to be making progress through the year in 2019. And so more is likely to come. What will be really interesting to see about the pandemic now is this is one of those data choices that people are going to face that is a real stark and vivid trade-off. You know, do you want to protect your privacy, or do you want to share your information so that contact tracing can unfold and maybe people's lives get saved? And you know, the trade-off isn't nearly that stark in lots of the other ways that people think about this stuff. So it's almost certainly the case that at the state level, you know, there'll be lots of movement on a variety of privacy-related things. What we don't, you know, nobody can tell you now about whether there'll be a federal privacy law or not, and whether the politics of privacy gets changed into any measurable way because of the way people are now thinking about you know, the pandemic and how to fight it. With, you got to get people's information in order to fight it, and you got to tell other people that they've been exposed. You can't tell them who exposed them, but you know, it's a big ask. It's the most intimate information. Who are you with? Well, who did you hang out with? How long were you there? And things like that. And so we're in a really interesting moment, which speaks to a question that's in the chat panel. Our research is going to focus a lot on this. You know, how the pandemic itself is being reflected in people's privacy calculations, but also, you know, heading into that Internet of Things future and the automated future. Privacy is just around for a long time now as a big issue.
Well, I think what we can say is, without any question, it is going to provide lots of opportunities for future research activities at Pew. Yeah,
it's you know, as a researcher, you're always in moral conflict. You know, the interesting research often result from, you know, big problems in the society, and so our goal at Pew is to try to generate the information that people who are trying to solve the problems think might be useful.
Absolutely.
How to solve the problems.
Well, thank you so much, Lee. Appreciate all those insights and all that wonderful information about what you've been up to and what you've been learning about all of us. So thank you again.